Alrighty, so let's get started. My name is Heather Miller. I am the executive director of this thing called the Scala Center at EPFL in Switzerland, and I'm also a professor at Northeastern University in Boston. I come from the Scala world, so I guess we're the alternative languages track. I did my PhD on Scala, and I continue to be in this funny little microcosm. Does anybody, I don't know how many people here are Scala people or have some, okay, cool, so I was a little bit worried because I threw in some of the stuff that we're kind of doing in the future at the Scala Center, and I was pretty sure I was going to lose everybody, so not everybody at least. Okay. Anyway, so this talk is about something, I mean, this is a lot more general than just Scala. This is about some trends that are happening in open source world that most people have no idea about, especially people who build companies on top of open source software. So if you're one of those, you should pay attention. I mean, really, and if you walk away with anything, what I want you to walk away with is a sense that, okay, there are some trends that we didn't realize, and actually this could be a problem pretty soon if we don't start doing something about it. So before I get into the nuts and bolts of what I'm going to talk about, let's start with a little riddle. So what does this have to do with Scala or with open source software? Or this? This is like a zebra crossing thing, right? Maybe these are a little bit confusing. What about this one? This one's got to be obvious. What does this have to do with open source software? The answer is that these things are all examples of common shared pieces of physical infrastructure. Anybody can use these things. You need to use these things to go to work or take your kids to school, or these things are pretty central to your day-to-day lives, right? The same is true for digital infrastructure, and I would argue that open source software can be considered our shared digital infrastructure, okay? And oh, by the way, just to try to not ruffle any feathers, I'm going to refer to open source as Floss. So there's this whole free software, open source. I am indiscriminately referring to all of that. So when I say Floss, that's what I mean. Anyway, so just like anybody can use a bridge or a sidewalk, anybody can use this free Libre open source software, this Floss, I guess. And projects, this means usually projects whose source code is open, which have permissive enough licenses for people to be able to freely use and remix the software. This is our digital infrastructure, I'd like to argue. And this is stuff that we can use to build software on top of, that we can then directly profit off of, or it just helps our day-to-day lives or businesses somehow, right? So this is shared digital infrastructure. I think it's a pretty good analogy. So, these are just some of those things. Lots of open source projects that you probably use or depend on at your job. Doesn't have to be Scala, it could be lots of things. And so if we go back to this physical infrastructure analogy, well, what do you do if this happens to your physical infrastructure? There's usually a pretty simple solution to this, right? Well, nowadays, since it's 2017, we have these apps that let us communicate with our local government. So as a concerned citizen, you say, well, this is an annoying pothole that's in front of my house. You report it to a local government somehow. There's, like I said, all these apps that inform your city that there's something that needs to be fixed. And somebody comes and fixes it. And, you pay taxes, so that funds these things getting fixed, right? But what about digital infrastructure? What if this was your digital infrastructure, if we keep this analogy? It's fundamentally distributed. There's no central government for paying taxes to get something fixed in the digital infrastructure, right? In our little open source digital infrastructure world, the common thing to do is to try and fix that pothole yourself, which is pretty hilarious. Imagine that was, people were just fixing bridges by themselves. Well, I use this bridge to go to school every day. I should fix it now that it's broken. That's crazy, right? So this, like I said, this talk is going to be in large part a talk about Floss or free Libre open source software, and towards the end I'll get back to Scala. So this is really general trends. That half of it is really general trends, or more than half it's like general trends, and then some things that we're trying to do in Scala to try and help these problems. Hopefully, maybe. And before I go any further, I want to give props to the sources of information that I pulled some of this from for this talk. So there were several people's writings and blogs that served as sources for the talks. These two are kind of the most important. Anything else I link to at the bottom of the slides, and I'll put the slides up online. So if you want to read any of this stuff, you're more than welcome to. But the first thing I have to say is does anybody know Nadia Egbal? She's an employee at GitHub. I think last year she was at the Ford Foundation, which is a foundation in the US, and basically for a whole year she analyzed open source software, basically, in organizations and how it's funded. She just interviewed lots of people, collected lots of information about it, and I've never seen a better pile of information about open source than in this document here. And then some of the things that we are taking inspiration from come from Peter Hinton's book called Social Architecture. So, okay. Everybody is jumping on this open source, Floss, whatever bandwagon. I argue this. I think that this is pretty standard now. I don't think anybody's going to disagree with this statement. But in case you do, every year for the last decade or so, this company called Black Duck has been running an annual survey asking companies about their open source use. So here's the 2016 survey. And they've been doing this for a long time, so it's actually a pretty good reference to go back to, because you can track over time sort of what companies are reporting they're doing with open source software. And in the 2015 and 2016 Future of Open Source surveys, they went to, in 2016, 1,300 companies, and in 2015, 1,200 companies. And in those 2 years, in 2015, they found that 78% of companies, of these 1,300 or so companies that they interviewed, run on open source, whatever that means, running on open source, which means I guess they're using open source a lot internally, right? And what's important to note here is that in 2010, when they asked the same question to another 1,100 or something companies, the answer that they got was 38%. So that's a 2x increase since 2010. So over 5 years, companies are jumping more and more on open source software, more than they did a few years ago. Okay? And another thing that they asked in the survey was, okay, well, why do you use Floss, right? And in 2016, if we rank the answers, the top 3 answers was actually quality of solutions. So it's actually a higher quality piece of, using an open source piece of software is higher quality than developing it internally yourself, because I don't know, maybe you don't have enough people to put on some task for that would be solved by a piece of software you could use from the open source world. I was actually surprised about that, because sometimes people laugh about open source software and weird things that you find in it, so this was cool to me. Competitive features and technical capabilities, so it's kind of the same with point 1. And finally, the ability to customize and fix. I thought that would be number 1, but it was number 3. So you can always fork or give back a fix to one of these pieces of software, right? And that's fine and dandy and whatever. This is really interesting, I thought, right? That in 2015, 66% of companies in this survey said that they would consider using Floss before considering proprietary alternatives. That's a big point. Floss is now the default choice, right? So that kind of makes sense from this funny little statistic I gave you, where since 2010, we see a 2x increase of companies depending on open source software, and now we're seeing, okay, well, companies go to open source software before they go to some proprietary solution. That means open source won, right? So that's a pretty cool point. All right, but let's get away from the survey. There's a lot of people echoing the sentiment. So we've got lots of venture capitalists or co-founders of startups echoing the sentiment. So Floss is widely viewed as a way to help startups scale quickly and save money, so you don't have to implement the same thing over and over again. And there is an entrepreneur named Mark Suster. I'm just going to read what he said, because I think it's best stated by him. When I built my first company starting in 1999, it cost $2.5 million in infrastructure just to get started, and then another $2.5 million in team costs to code, launch, manage, and market and sell our software. So he paid $2.5 million in just software infrastructure, right? Open source has become a movement, a mentality. Suddenly infrastructure software is basically free. We pay now 10% of the normal costs for the software, and that money was actually for software support, right? So you go to some company that offers support for open source, and it's significantly cheaper than actually having to buy something proprietary. So that's a 90% disruption in costs, which spawns innovation, believe me. That's his argument. I believe that was in 2011. And the co-founder of Instagram, Mark Krieger, he wrote a blog article. I'm not sure what year that was, probably 2012 or so, 2013. He wrote, he was advising people about how to save money and scale quickly if you're starting a startup. So how do you pick tech for your startup? And what he suggested was, well, borrow instead of building whenever you can. There are hundreds of fantastic open source projects that have been built through the hard experience of creating and scaling companies, especially around infrastructure and monitoring, that can save you time and let you focus on actually building out your product, okay? So, I mean, these are just two examples, but a lot of people advocate this, especially in the whole VC startup world, right? This is a blog post by Nadia. I find this really cool. I'm not going to defend the calculations that she did in this blog article. I'm just going to repeat the main point that she arrived at, which is basically if you look at the $1 billion acquisition of Instagram, and you do some calculation, which she details in this article, then you could argue that $143 million of that acquisition probably accounted for all of the open source software that they pull into their organization, right? So effectively free stuff. So that's a pretty, I mean, whatever the number is, if you just look at the percentage of their code base, probably some percentage is worth a lot of money, even if this calculation is not correct, okay? So the point is that here's lots of money moving around, but I don't know, it's not going to the open source projects, right? At the same time, so, you know, you've got all these companies building very valuable things on top of open source projects. At the same time, these open source projects that people are building stuff on top of, they don't exactly scale in terms of the number of contributors or contributions with the number of people using their software. So you have users like this, contributors like this, right? Well, that's an interesting thing that's happening, okay. In 2014, we all remember this, right? I'm not going to talk about Heartbleed, but OpenSSL, we all know that 66% of basically all web servers are running or using OpenSSL. Meanwhile, OpenSSL was really maintained only by a handful of volunteers, so people that aren't paid to do this, right? I copied, so here are the references here. I will post these slides later, but I pulled some of these quotes out of I think a blog article by this guy named Steve Marcus. So Steve Marcus was one of these volunteers, and he noticed that one other contributor named Steve Henson was working full-time on OpenSSL, and he was, well, how's that possible if you're doing this full-time? So Steve Marcus asked Steve Henson, hey, what do you do for money? How can you do this full-time? And he was surprised to learn that the income that Steve Henson had was only 1/5 of Marcus's income. So he got paid basically peanuts to maintain OpenSSL via contracting and things like this. So Marcus had always considered himself to be a strong programmer, but he thought his skills really paired in comparison to Henson's, so he felt bad about it. And Henson, to top it all off, had been working on OpenSSL since 1998, so it's been a long time. In 2014 that he was kind of scraping by on OpenSSL, right? So what Steve Marcus says is, well, I'd always assumed that as probably the rest of the world had, that the OpenSSL team was large, active, and well-resourced, but in reality that wasn't the case at all. OpenSSL was barely even able to support one person's work, and yet industry, government, etc., everybody doesn't really realize this when they depend on these things, right? So basically nobody is guaranteed to be working on some of the projects that you depend on. We all know that a ton of money came in and got donated to OpenSSL. They have fewer funding problems now, but pre-Heartbleed, this was the situation, which is not good, right? That's pretty scary. So have you ever heard of the truck factor? No? One person has? This is cool. Okay, 2 people. All right. So this, I think this is hilarious in a bad way. So the truck factor is the minimal number of developers that have to be hit by a truck or quit a project before the project basically dies. Yeah, it's the bus factor as well as another import. Yeah, I like truck factor. I also like this ridiculous truck. This American crazy thing. So in, I think it was actually in 2016, this past year, there was a university in Brazil that did a little study. They looked at the 133 most active projects on GitHub, and then they tried to determine the amount of information concentrated in commits, like how much code people were moving around in logic. And they basically wanted to calculate then from that the truck factor for all of these 133 most active projects. And the result that they found was that 64% of projects, 64% of the top 133 projects on GitHub had a truck factor of 1 or 2. Yeah, so you probably, depending on some piece of software that has the truck factor 1, that would really suck if it disappeared tomorrow, right? That's horrible. Now that, you know, I didn't realize how bad this was, and wow, okay. So here, I mean, you don't have to try to read this. The point of this chart is just to show you that, so it's a table. On the left side is the truck factor that's circled there, or whatever, the orange thing. And then the stuff is the groups of repositories that are in the different truck factors. So at the very top, we have truck factor 1, the bottom, we have truck factor 250. And as you can see, the most repositories are concentrated in the first 2 rows. And I mean, this is all kinds of interesting stuff that you probably care about. Let me see if I can read some of it to you. So there's stuff like, well, I guess less is not the most important thing anymore. React, RX Java, it's truck factor 1. There's a bunch of JS things in here. Let's see. Well, Atom Shell, I guess. There were some more interesting ones in that. Oh, SAS. SAS is in here. Do you use SAS? Truck factor 1 SAS. There's a Clojure is truck factor 2, if anybody uses Clojure. Elasticsearch, this Logstash thing from Elasticsearch. Jade, truck factor 2. Pandas, Python Pandas, truck factor 2. Netty, truck factor 2. Anybody use Netty? Okay. I can keep on doing this, but the point is that there's stuff that you've heard of that's truck factor 1 and 2. That maybe you'll use it. That's not good. Yeah, it makes me feel bad. So, all right, I'm going to read another quote to you since I can't get enough of that. So this is this also comes from this Roads and Bridges report. This is basically a longtime Python developer, and he's a member of the Python Software Foundation. He summarized this shift, I think, very well. And he said, in the early days of the open source movement, there were relatively few projects, and in general, most people were using a project were also contributing back to it in some way. But both of these things in recent years have changed by likely uncountable orders of magnitude. So as we've moved to more and more niche tools, it becomes harder to justify the time investment to be a contributor now. And basically what you have is this growing imbalance between producers and consumers. So in the past, these things were roughly in balance, but everybody put time and effort into the commons and everybody reaped the benefits. These days, very few people put in that effort, and a vast majority simply benefit from those who do. This imbalance has become so ingrained that for a company to repay in either time or money, even a small fraction of the value they derive from the commons is almost unthinkable. So this is the trend that I hope you agree is perhaps worrying. And also there's this thing that's happening is that as you have more and more people who are using stuff, so you have more and more users, maintainers, these people that are putting in time into the commons, they're becoming very strained. So I don't want to, there's a bunch of these, and I can't, cite all the best ones, but there's a lot of instances of maintainer or contributor burnout. This is one example of a guy from who worked on Ruby on Rails, and he basically was like, okay, I'm done, I'm quitting. He explains that I don't have the time or energy to invest in open source anymore, I'm not being paid to do this work, and so the work I do is the time that I could be spending doing life stuff or writing. It's not fair to expect me to do even more work outside of my regular work and not get fairly compensated in time or money for it. It's also a great recipe for burnout and making me just generally grumpy. So people are getting stressed out and quitting, and this is also because what we have is a very much like a buyers always rent mentality coming to open source projects. People who don't pay for the software but request and demand support and attention and things, maybe are grumpy, writing angry emails to people who are just doing this for free on their weekends, right? It's a great way to upset somebody, make them quit. All right, one more thing that I think is scary. So okay. Everybody's going floss crazy, hooray, the cool kids are doing it, except not just the cool kids. The Department of Defense is also doing it in the US. This has actually been known for a long time, but I think it's funny. I think it's a funny report in a, again, scary way. In 2013, there was a report that the US Department of Defense commissioned about using open source, basically. And basically what it showed was that the US Department of Defense was a major user of Floss, even in mission-critical situations back in 2013. Some interesting things that the report concluded was that unexpectedly the Department of Defense relies very heavily on open source software. And basically the whole report was all about, no, don't ban open source software at the Department of Defense. We need it. Instead, promote broader and more effective use of Floss. Please, 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 we want more. And here's a direct quote from this report. Floss applications tend to be much lower in cost than their proprietary equivalents, yet they often provide high levels of functionality with good user acceptance. Okay, so let's go back to this burned out contributor thing. We don't want this burned out contributor who has a piece of software that's like driving a missile somewhere, quitting. I don't know, that seems horrifying, okay? So we're like putting very important things on the back of these poor stressed out people that are doing it in their nights and their weekends. So I think, so this is just a summary of the trends. Using Floss over proprietary software is now mainstream, no longer a contentious issue. We use open source software first. Startups, enterprise, and even governments are depending on this digital infrastructure. And now we have this untenable situation where we have orders of magnitude more users or the same or fewer contributors. So that seems kind of scary. And the biggest point that if you were sleeping the whole time is that nobody really realizes this problem. It's not really widely accepted yet. So now I'm going to go back into the Scala world. We know that this is an issue, and we're trying to reverse this trend, at least in our little corner of the universe. And I have no solution for this, but what we're trying to do right now, since there's a lot of companies that depend on Scala nowadays, what we're trying to encourage people to do is to give back to open source in some way. So allow companies to let their engineers contribute to some of the infrastructure that they depend on during company time. So basically, if you profit off of it, give something back to the shared infrastructure. It can be anything, can be the build tool, whatever. So how does that come back to us? Well, we founded this thing called the Scala Center. It's a not-for-profit center that's established at EPFL, which is the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. One thing, I always have to do this because people seem to think that we're from California and we're not. So this is not California. This is actually where the Scala logo comes from, this like weird red staircase thing. This is the building that we work in. And we have this mission statement, which, everybody has a mission statement, right? But ours basically is to independently guide and support the entire Scala community, coordinate and develop open source libraries that are really for the benefit of everybody, and to provide educational materials that are freely available, essentially, right? So we want to do these things to try and ensure that open source around Scala continues to thrive, or grows, or gets bigger and better. We're funded by 10 companies right now. They're all major stakeholders in Scala, so they'll be from totally different industries that have nothing to do with each other. The one common thread is that they have decided to make Scala a core part of whatever they're doing. So this goes from banks to entertainment companies. And it's equally backed, so nobody has any more influence than the other one. And so this is where we get money from, and it's enough to hire some people. We're not rolling in cash. But with that money, we try to make it easier to contribute to the core Scala ecosystem, or to core Scala and the core Scala ecosystem. We basically want to increase the truck factors for the things that the most people depend on. And we also want to grow basically the contributor user base. Sure, we want more users, but we think this is important, that, something that nobody is really focusing so much on. And so this is where it gets, this talk starts getting Scala focused. So I will try to not put you to sleep if you don't know or care about Scala. But these are kind of the four main things that we're doing right now. One thing is breaking up the standard library, defining something called Scala Core, and then giving people control over the libraries because they've been locked down in a distribution that people have been getting for years. And all the stuff that's in the standard library should go into this thing called the Scala Platform, which has all kinds of I/O stuff, all the things you want to use. But we want this to be in the hands of the people who depend on it, really. And we do a number of other things. So ecosystem hackathons, teaching people how to get involved in open source because you don't really necessarily know how. Also, sometimes it's hard to deal with a grumpy maintainer or a grumpy contributor, trying to teach people how to do that. and then this thing called the Scala improvement process, which is how we deal with changing the language based on people's feedback. So I don't want to get into lots of detail about these things, but just really to try and reiterate the point from earlier is that right now we have everything baked into this thing called Scala library. We want to break it into two pieces. One thing, which is just the basic essence of Scala that the compiler uses or needs, to do things, to run itself basically, and then everything else will be in this thing called Scala Platform, and this is in the hands of the community, and that's the stuff that the compiler team needs. So also this is something that I think is really important, putting faces on projects, and also requesting people to tell us if something is crazy, and to be giving people opportunities to let us know how we should direct what we're doing, basically. So this one is being run by one of our engineers named Julian. Another thing is this Scala Platform process. So this is the whole process of breaking everything up into libraries and letting the ecosystem, or letting the community take care of it. So what we are doing is very much like a regular software foundation. We're providing infrastructure for building, continuous integration, and releasing. So helping people release stuff because it can be a real pain in the neck. And also helping with project governance, so giving people social processes and just rules and things to be able to sort of run their project without a hitch, pretty much. That's our goals. So we really want to take as much burden off of the platform library authors, abstract away all the stuff that everybody kind of has to do anyway, so that the people who focus on these core libraries in the ecosystem are able to focus on the issues, and we can help with all the other stuff. So I'm not gonna, I'll skip this, but this is basically some of the infrastructure that we provide. So basically things that make sure that everything is compatible with one another. So we have build plugins and things, continuous integration on clusters that we have at EPFL, and a thing that helps people release their libraries. And the governance side of these things is, a lot of it is based on this book that Peter Hintians wrote called Social Architecture. There's this C4 contract which aims to decentralize decentralize decision making, and this is it's basically an evolution of the GitHub pull fork model. And the whole goal is really just to set up this process that lets people make their own decisions and to make sort of a happy contributor community. And we just kind of, so we introduced this platform process, and this guy, Jorge Cantaro, is the one responsible for designing this. And it's something we released just at the end of the year, and we're just getting it going now. We're currently evolving it based on people's feedbacks. And again, we're trying to create places where people can provide this feedback. So we got a shiny new Discourse installation, which is already pretty active. So people are basically debating how these things should develop in this sort of public watering hole, which I think is better than a mailing list, but that's my opinion. And finally, almost finally, is these ecosystem hackathons that we're doing. So actually, I think this is pretty cool, and this is useful for just not Scala. If you don't care about Scala, this is a pretty cool thing. We're going to be soon releasing kind of our recipe for this. But what we've done is we've come up with a structure for running these hackathons. And the idea is that, basically you get a bunch of project maintainers in the room. So let's say there are some central libraries that everybody cares about. We get those guys to come to the hackathon, and we have those people curate around 5 or 10 tickets that somebody could do within 3 or 4 hours as a total beginner to their project. And they come hang out and they just walk around and help people, basically. We do this alongside of conferences usually, so it's not like it takes probably 2 hours or so of a contributor's time to set up these curated tickets. So it's not like it's totally free. The guy or girl has to think about what some beginner can do in 3 or 4 hours and try to curate this list with appropriate instructions. They don't have to go into super detail because they'll also be at the hackathon. Basically the goal, so we do this in a pair programming sort of setup. 2 people sit next to each other and try to solve one of these issues, and the project maintainer, like I said, is in the room. And the goal of the participants is to have at least 1 PR merged by the end of the hackathon. So, I mean, even if it's a smallish thing, and everybody who manages to merge a pull request gets one of these cool t-shirts, basically. That's the incentive. But it works pretty well. I can't tell you like what the success percentage is, but it's like maybe 80% of people who come to this thing manage to get a pull request merged during the hackathon, which is really cool. So lots of people who had never contributed to any open source software before learned how to do it. And so far this has worked pretty well. We've done this at probably 5 conferences now. And it's a half a day thing, so we do it like, 9 a.m. to noon or something like that, or after lunch. And lots of people tend to be really happy, and so we're right now trying to ship this to local user groups, so people can kind of repeat this formula, because sometimes hackathons can be not productive. You can be sitting there eating pizza and not doing anything, so this was pretty cool that it worked. So yeah, like I said, we're trying to send this, make this a recipe that can be repeatable. And here we go, there's the success rate. So the people in the Scala t-shirts were the ones who succeeded. Okay, this is, if you don't care about Scala, none of these things called SIPs matter too much to you, except that these are currently in process changes to the language, some accepted, some rejected, and some that we're currently in the process of iterating on with the people who are in charge of the Scala compiler are trying to get these things moving, because some of them are proposals that just don't have enough information in their initial iteration, so it takes more work to make sure if they make sense. So these are in process. So this is the Scala improvement process that I was talking about. It's a committee of basically the core compiler team that meets once a month and tries to push these things forward and help contributors who are working on these hard things figure out what they need to do next in order to get that into the language or compiler. And again, I have to tell you, like, we're doing all of this stuff on Discourse. This is where we kind of pool feedback on these language changes. So if you absolutely hate something that we're doing, the best place to tell us that it's the worst idea ever is Discourse. Example, well, that's not a negative comment, but still. Okay, but those are, I just wanted to kind of give you a flavor of the sorts of things that we're trying to do to help people become contributors or to give back in some way. We're trying to give people some support. So I'll leave you with kind of that list of things that we've tried. But if you don't care about Scala, you have nothing to do with Scala, really, you should remember, I'm giving you one more quote and then that's it, I swear, I promise, the last one, okay? In the last 5 years, open source infrastructure has become an essential layer of our social fabric, but much like startups and technology itself, what worked for the first 30 years of open source history won't work moving forward. In order to maintain our pace of progress, we need to invest back into the tools that help us build bigger and better things. So I think that this, is a good point. We have this whole history of the free software and open source movement behind us, and sort of the thought patterns that we've kind of gotten from these movements don't necessarily work going forward now that open source effectively has won. So now we have to rethink our strategy, basically, and we should probably start trying to give back to the things that we depend on. And so that's all I'm going to say. And yes, we don't want any money, we want pull requests, so you should do the same thing at your company too. All right, I'm happy to answer questions if there are any. It's got to be one question. You can ask what font that is. Oh, that's a good question. So I didn't calculate it because I didn't completely understand the math that this paper used to calculate the truck factor from the other repositories. But if I had to give you an unofficial guess, it's probably 6. Better than 2. Not amazing, but better than 2. But if you want to talk about our build tool, probably 2. And our build tool, nobody downloads. So you download Python or you download Java or something, and then you have it on the command line, you just use it. In Scala, you don't ever download Scala. You download the build tool, and then the build tool chooses Scala versions for every project that you try to compile. So the build tool is really the window into Scala. And the fact that it has basically, I don't know, maybe a truck factor 2 is pretty horrifying. Somebody's got a question, yep. Yeah, good question. So, no, not technically. So, to give a little history, if people who know about light bend, type safe, light safe, type bend, Sorry, I can't get over this. So this was the company that was founded in 2012 to be like the Red Hat of Scala, kind of. They still do Scala things. They still actually develop the Scala compiler pretty much. We make pull requests back. We are doing some things, like I said, dealing with the libraries. We're implementing some things in the compiler, but they're the ones still making stable development releases of the language. So they're in charge of the 2.x series of Scala officially. You want to talk about what comes next? EPFL is in charge of that. So there's this new Scala compiler called Dottie that's being developed at EPFL right now. So we have some involvement in that. But where we separate concerns is we let them continue to make the official 2.x Scala releases, and we try to do everything else. We deal with libraries, we make pull requests to the compiler, we make pull requests to the build tools. We do lots of things. And actually, I didn't talk very much about the mechanics of the advisory board thing. So we have 10 companies, and the way that it works is, well, we listen to the community, so people who give us feedback on our discourse/mailing list forum things, but we also listen to companies. And the companies, we make them meet with us once every 3 months to tell us, okay, what's the issue? So we discover problems that people are having at scale with Scala through these meetings with companies. And so we collect feedback and decide what we should do. And usually it's a lot more related to tooling. So like the build tool, for example, things that, these are the things that need more attention. So the relationship is we are putting out the biggest fires right now that they are not putting out. We're working together. We have no relationship other than they are selling subscriptions, and we have nothing to do with subscriptions, or we're just not for profit completely. So we'll listen to people's complaints and try to solve their problems, but we don't offer support. You know, you can just go pay them if you want support. We have nothing to do with that. So we try to, you know, if we need something, I can go to the compiler team and ask them for it. Vice versa, if they need help with something that we're better at, we'll help them. But there's no like kickbacks or anything happening, nothing secret. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes. 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 Yeah. Yes. Trying to. Yeah. Actually, I had this amazing last weekend. I ran this. So we just started these Scala Bridge things. So if you know Ruby and Go, they have these bridge things. So it's about increasing diversity in, you know, these little communities. So for Go or for Ruby or for Scala. I mean, we've started a few of these. I mean, this is totally decentralized. People who care about it do it. I started one in Switzerland, and last weekend this amazing thing happened. So who thinks Scala is hard, first of all? Okay, let me tell you, 2 16-year-old girls who had never programmed before, their aunt was scared that they didn't know what a file was. Okay, because they do everything on tablets nowadays, right? So why should they be having files? What's a file? And I'm like, well, we're going to have to compile the file, you know? And then you get something that you can run. And we thought, oh my God, they're not going to be able to do this. These two girls got through a 9-hour thing, a 9-hour Scala Bridge thing in 3 hours, faster than a bunch of professional developers, and they thought it was easy. Then we taught them Git. 2 16-year-old girls. They don't even have computers. They had just phones and tablets. So I was totally mind blown. Like, okay, I'm never going to complain about anything being hard again, because these girls just kind of, I don't know, they were like, well, that makes sense. I'm like, well, good, that makes sense. I'm happy that makes sense. Anyway, so yeah, the point here is, goodness gracious, there are lots of people out there who have no idea that they could be good at programming, and these two girls who didn't even have a computer figured it out really fast and loved it. So we're doing these things, trying to get more other people than just white guys into programming in Scala. And it's working pretty well. At least we got these 2 16-year-old girls. A bunch of other women too, but I was amazed at these girls who just used tablets. And they were like, whoa, easy. But yeah, so we're running these, and we're running them at a greater frequency now. They kind of just got off the ground at the beginning of the year, so there's been 3 of them only so far. One in Seattle, San Francisco, and then in Switzerland. So we're running another one in Chicago and another one in Copenhagen, but we're trying to encourage more people to start them locally. So we still have a couple more minutes, because I talk too fast, so I apologize. Anybody else got any more questions? Yep. Yeah, there's still a fork. So I can't comment because I'm not working on it, so I can't say, oh, whatever, they're doing this new thing. I know that basically interest was like this, was like, yay, okay, it's really hard. And then they didn't do very much on it for like a year or so, maybe 2 years. And then they've started getting back into it again. And their policy, as far as I know, is to basically whatever they do in their compiler, they try to put it into the Scala, like the mainline Scala compiler first, or concurrently, or whatever. But yeah, it's not as like hooray anymore. It's like hooray. But yeah, it still exists. It still exists. I can't say that it's like a mainstream thing that people are using, but it's out there. It's a nice playground if you want to try and mess with the Scala compiler. Any other questions? Yep. Yep, that's true. Yeah, that's a fine model. The only issue with that is though, is that then you have the company kind of controlling the evolution of something that maybe isn't really in everybody's general interest sometimes. So I think this is where the Apache model really shines, where you have, I mean, you can still have a company basically owning a piece of software where all of the contributors are from that company and there's like one guy who's not. I mean, but it's still possible to get in and to be a contributor or committer to a project and then also shape where it goes and not be only baked into that company's financial interests. Because sometimes, I mean, think about the things that you use the most. If some bank or something really wanted to do something that's not in your interest with that tool, that would suck for you if you're using it for something else. So that's the only downside to it, but it's, I mean, a good side still that somebody is being paid to develop a tool that other people need, for sure. Okay. Since it's now coffee time, I free you. Thank you for coming.